Okay, we're here with ESPN's Jorge Sedano. Finally, getting to do this. Thanks so much for coming on the show, George.
Yeah, man. Sorry it's taken so long. It's just been a crazy ride the last few months.
It has been. You're doing so much for ESPN. You're wearing a lot of hats. I want to get to that here in a little bit, but we're recording this the afternoon after Game 1 of the finals. And I don't know about you, but well, first of all, you've long been out there, one of the few in the national media, advocating that the Heat were legit contenders. Obviously, they're not in the finals anymore, but I was watching that game last night and I was like, I don't know if Miami could have hung in a game quite like that. What were you thinking?
Um, Not in the dilapidated state that they were in, right?
Right.
I think that would have been the issue. But I do think a healthy Miami team could have won a championship, and I think this series will bear that out because I think that Boston has a decent chance of winning. Although I picked the Warriors in 7, I think it was more along the lines of I just feel like the Warriors have a higher ceiling on offense, and I think that points, the offense, both teams are good on defense, so offense is going to determine who wins this series, in my estimation.
Right.
And by offense, I don't mean just like scoring points per se. That's obviously the goal, but whose offense looks more fluid with two teams that are top 5 defenses in Boston and the Warriors. And I felt like Miami at full strength could have competed with either of these teams. I actually think, look, I still believe if you would have told me that Miami was 100% healthy, I would have picked them to beat Boston in less than 7 games, probably.
Yeah.
But that was my original pick, was Heat in 7. But yeah, I just think it came down to health, and it's just the unfortunate situation with Miami because look, everyone is banged up. Yes, I get that, but to me, there's a difference between being hurt and being injured,
Right.
and I feel like Miami had a lot of guys that were injured, whereas other teams may have had guys who have just been hurt.
Yeah, I mean, what was happening to Jimmy Butler and Kyle Lowry even was much different than what was happening with Robert Williams, right? And so I'm with you on that, and obviously not having Tyler Herro in there, but it kind of does like one more season, whether or not it was derailed by injuries or not, you don't accomplish your ultimate goal, which is to win the championship. One more season goes by. Jimmy Butler's one more year older. PJ Tucker, Kyle Lowry, same thing. The window isn't like that open for this Heat group. I'm curious what you think about what their priorities should be in this offseason in order to, keep that window propped open to win a championship.
They need a secondary scorer that they can rely upon. I think
Yeah.
that that's probably the thing that I would be most interested in. And look, could Tyler Hero become that guy? Yeah, maybe. You know what I mean? But we've seen that in the playoffs in that Philly series when he was schemed against,
Mm-hmm.
it was a little different. And then he got banged up in the Boston series. So, but prior to being banged up, at least to our knowledge, it wasn't great either.
Right.
They were a negative with him on the floor, and I think that despite the growth he's had, and he's only 22 years old, I get that. I just don't know if the window works. To your point, I think that with Jimmy particularly, you've got what, a 3 or 4 year window before his contract expires, another 3 or 4, I guess. But the idea is you really got 1 or 2,
You're right.
with him at potentially the peak of his powers. Because on the other side of 32 or 33, I don't know how much you can depend on that, especially 34, 35, right? Like,
Right.
I think he'll be 36 by the end of the contract, right? I could
Yeah.
be wrong.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
yeah. So I think that you need to take advantage now in his early 30s before things start to potentially go south because he's got an injury history.
Mm-hmm.
And this knee issue has been a consistent issue since Minnesota. So it's not like this is something that's new. So they're just going to have to manage it. And for all the people that get upset about, oh, he only plays 60 games or whatever, that might be the way it happens moving forward. And you should be okay with that if these are the performances you're going to get in the postseason. But yeah, they need a reliable second scorer. I don't know who that person is. I'm sure everybody out there on social media has labeled Donovan Mitchell or Bradley Beal or, you name it, they've got it. But they need someone who's a more reliable second scoring threat because I think that ideally Bam is like your perfect third player on a
Right.
championship team.
Yeah, he's like a Chris Bosh. I call him like Al Horford on steroids. That's a really, really good player. And considering where they got him in the draft, that's a really, really good player. And I think people just put these expectations on him that are so crazy sometimes. Tyler Hero was really, to me, the guy that needed to step up. But you're right. Like sometimes maybe he could become that, but sometimes the windows just don't line up. And the Heat are sort of in this weird situation where they have like the Bam and Tyler window and then the Jimmy Butler window slash, I guess, Kyle Lowry window. And they got to try to figure out how to make the most of the first one. And potentially that might mean sacrificing some of that second window in the long term. I'm going to give you $1 to bet on one of two things. The Heat make a big swing this offseason, or they just sort of tinker around the edges of the roster. Where are you putting that dollar?
Well, I think they're going to try to swing big. I think when they can, they always try to swing big. Now, that may not come to fruition because it takes two to tango in those situations. So, for all the
Right.
fans with the photoshops of Donovan Mitchell and Bradley Beal, and I've seen the ridiculous ones with Joel Embiid and even LeBron James, like I don't see any of that happen. I don't see the latter two happening at all. I don't
Right.
think Joel Embiid is leaving Philadelphia. Not right now. Now, look, can things change? Oh, things can always change. I listen, I've learned in this league you can't rule anything out. I will say this, the LeBron part of it, I don't see happening either. But you know, if the Heat draft Bronny in a couple of years, maybe. You know what I'm saying? But by then, I don't know what I'm sure LeBron will still be a good player
Right.
by then. I just don't think he'll be what LeBron is even at this stage of his career, which is
Maybe
still
could they just draft Shabazz Napier again? Would that work?
that I don't know if that's going to help. But yeah, I think they try to swing big. I think they look. They've got Tyler obviously as an asset, and the Duncan contract. For all the lamenting about it, he still hit 232 threes this year. Okay,
Yeah.
like think about that. That's a bad year, and he hit 232 threes, and he
Yeah.
still crept around. What was it, 37, 38% despite the terrible start.
Yep.
He's still a functional player. The problem is he's got to be on a team that has a bunch of really good defenders on it.
Mhm.
And I think there are some of those teams out there, but I wonder if they're willing to take on Duncan Robinson because there's still a number of years left on that contract. So you may have to throw in a sweetener there. The good thing about the Heat is that they've got draft capital at the moment. So I think that they've got more capital than they've had in a long, long time. So they could deploy that if necessary. But yeah, I think that those are your two assets that you're looking at. And then you're always going to look at the margins because winning in the margins helps you win in the playoffs.
Mhm.
Max Strus had a couple of big games in the playoffs. PJ Tucker had big moments in the playoffs. So I think between that and Lowry being healthy, and I know Spoelstra mentioned being in a certain kind of shape, Kyle dealt with a lot of stuff this season uh, personally, hence why he was out for personal reasons for a long time. I'm not going to get into the reasons as to why he was out for personal reasons, but I'm guessing that played a big factor in just A, the continuity, and B, just kind of even his ability to be in the moment, right? Now,
Right.
I'm not saying that Kyle Lowry isn't focused when he's in games, but it's human nature to have to be able to juggle multiple things and not be able to do all of them well, is what I would
Right.
say.
You touched on a few things there, but the thing that really stands out to me about this team is, yeah, they have the assets. Everybody on the internet is throwing all of these assets into the trade machine and trying to get X superstar to pop out of it. We'll see if that ultimately happens with Miami, but it does sort of feel like that is still. I'm with you. I think if they can make the big swing, they will. They certainly will try it. That's long been Pat Riley's sort of motto. The interesting thing is that on the back end of all of that is this developmental program that they've put together, right? I think there was sort of an organizational philosophy saying, hey, if we're just going to trade all these first round picks, we better be developing young players somehow, whether that's through the G League or whatever. And so they've done a really good job with the Gabe Vincents and Max Struses and Caleb Martins and things like that. And dating back to Tyler Johnson, Hassan Whiteside. I mean, all these guys that they've found. That's kind of a new thing with them. I mean, it's especially from the days of like the end of the big three when they were like, Rashard Lewis, you're 50 years old. Come on in. Like doing stuff like that. How have you seen? You've long been reporting on the team. I know you're in LA now, but you still have connections to the team. Like in your years covering the Heat and knowing the people in the Heat and that organization, how have you seen sort of the organizational philosophy change over those years?
Look, I always felt like they were into developmental stuff. I just think now they realize with the way the salary structures are that you really need to win in those margins, right?
Yeah.
Because the salaries are so astronomical that you're going to be top heavy. Like even a team like Miami, which was more of a sum of the parts team, is still fairly top heavy, right? Jimmy Butler makes
Mhm.
a ton of money, Bam Adebayo makes a ton of money, Kyle Lowry makes a ton of money, and then Duncan Robinson makes a good amount of money, right? So then Tyler Herro still it makes a pretty good amount of money, even though he's on a rookie contract. But then after that, there's probably and I'm sure I'm missing a guy here. PJ Tucker, I guess, was a mid-level guy. But after that, like you're looking at minimum level contract types. So
Right.
you have to be good at that. But if you go back even to before Pat was here in Miami with the Knicks, John Starks was a CBA player. Anthony Mason was a CBA player when he came to Miami. Ike Austin was a reclamation project that they found basically off the scrap heap. Anthony Carter was a
Right.
guy like that. And they were always good at finding a couple of those guys. But to your point now, when you're talking about 8 undrafted players on your roster, that takes it to a completely different level. And, it's a combination of everyone there working, but whether it's Chet Kammerer who oversees that, but really Adam Simon is the guy, in my opinion, that uncovers all these diamonds in the rough here over the last, I don't know, post LeBron era is the way I would
Mhm.
call it. So I think that Adam is as important as anyone to me in uncovering a lot of these guys. And he's done a phenomenal job. I think that's kind of been the biggest difference is as he's elevated, he's had more ability and more say as to who is on the roster and who are some of the guys that fit what they want to do in those margins. So I think there's that. There's always been an idea of development, but I think that it's definitely become more of an urgent thing as they've seen the landscape of the salary cap and the game change in that regard. So I think that's really just it because they've always been good at reclamation projects too. I mean, I can go down a laundry list of point guards when I was a kid growing up, from Eric Murdoch to Terry Porter to John Crotty. I don't know if I'd call them reclamation projects, but guys at the end of their career that they
Right.
squeezed out the last good dosage of their careers out of. Rod Strickland is another guy, even though that was a bad year for them. Those were the times when Zoe was hurt, I'm sorry, had the kidney issue. He wasn't hurt, but he had the
Right.
medical issue. So, but they've always been good at finding those kind of diamonds in the roughs or reclamation projects. They've just done a better job of finding them in bulk now, just based on the economics of the game.
Yeah, and there's sort of that inner circle. You mentioned Cameron and Adam Simon, obviously Pat Riley, Alonzo Mourning. Like there's sort of like Nick Harrison, Eric Spoelstra is part of that inner circle too. And I think a part of Eric Spoelstra's story that gets a little bit overlooked is the video coordinator stuff, but also player development, right? And he was really
Oh
big.
man, it's so funny you mentioned that. So I went on the Ryan Russillo podcast a couple weeks ago. Um, I think before Game 6 so it was last week maybe
Okay.
of the Heat Celtics, and that I brought that up. That was my point. Like everybody talks about video coordinating, nobody talks about the fact that he was a really good player development guy. That he helped Dwyane get a really consistent mid-range shot, and that was kind of what his job was for a really long time. So I'm sorry, continue.
No, I mean, let's just go there because I wanted to talk to you about like those early Dwyane Wade days because you got your start covering the Heat during the Shaq years, right? When Shaq
Yeah,
first
when Dwyane was
got to
drafted,
Miami.
that was
Yeah.
I came in when Dwyane came in.
So, what was it like covering a young Dwyane Wade, following his career, and did you ever think he was going to be hosting the Ellen DeGeneres show?
No, definitely not when I met him. Dwyane Wade, when I met him, was a shy kid, man. Like
Yeah.
super shy. I don't even know if I mean he was confident in his basketball skills. But I would say that, there was still some, just growing up to do, right?
Right.
When we first met him. And I think but very quickly though, that changed. And I think really a number of things happen. And he has told me this in the past, so I'll just kind of relay the conversation. Where he talks about just having good vets his rookie year, where Eddie Jones, Brian Grant, even though Lamar was younger or was only a little older, pardon me, than him, having those guys there. And then, I think he really he kind of took the ball for sure when Shaq got there because Shaq also emboldened him in a lot of ways. And look, that relationship is great. Was great at the beginning, is great now. There were some times there it wasn't great. But Dwyane and Shaq, but Dwyane specifically has always been the bigger person in those regards.
Mhm.
But yeah, I saw him grow up, like literally, and I'm only 5 years older than him. So we kind of, I mean, I was a punk kid like covering this team.
How
And
old
he
are you? You
was,
must have been what? Then if you were 5 years older, 27, would you have been?
yeah, I was
Okay.
26, 2003. I was 26 when this, well, 27. Yeah, 27 when the season started.
Okay.
So yeah, like I was, really young to be covering a team. And yeah, so, and he was a young guy who was, we saw very quickly though, like, oh yeah, the guy that got the triple double against Kentucky, this guy's legitimately good.
Yeah.
And it's funny because if you remember, they tried to make him a point guard first, and had the ball in his hands, and I think that really helped him from a development standpoint. To your point, and I think so. I think Stan kind of entrusting him that way. I think Eric also working with him with the ball handling and the jumpers and things of that nature, and kind of helping his offensive game blossom really kind of allowed him to explode kind of halfway through that first season, if you
Right.
recall.
Mhm.
And then we started to really see him take off. And then obviously Shaq got there, and he was a completely different player by the time year two rolled around and beyond. And we knew right then and there, you could see year two, he was a Hall of Fame caliber player. But yeah, it was crazy for me as a young person still in the business for sure at 26 and 27 years old, because when they drafted him, I was 26, so I was already covering the team at that stage. But I was still very wet behind the ears to cover a professional basketball team, and it was cool though. They had a really good group those first 2 years. Obviously, that first group with Dwyane was, as I mentioned, Eddie and Brian, who were just
Yeah.
the epitome of professionals. Rafer Alston was fantastic to cover. Udonis obviously was incredible. Lamar Odom, still one of my favorite people. Karan Butler, so many great guys. And then that second team, with Alonzo came back, and Michael Doliak, and Christian Leitner was fun to talk to. Keon Dooling, Damon Jones, Shaq, obviously. It was just those first 2 years were a really fun group. The third year, though, that was like, thank God I had 2 years of seasoning, because that third year group,
Gary
while they
Payton
were,
walks in the building and
yeah, it's different. Like, you know what I
right.
mean? Like, you've got to be ready as a reporter. These are veteran guys
Yeah.
now. So it changed a little bit, but I think everyone was, or I at least was ready because of those first 2 years, because those guys were easy to deal with. But I think that not that those guys were hard to deal with for me in 2006, but it was definitely different. I would say, just because they're
Right.
more veteran, right? Like they expect a certain level of conversation back and forth. If not, it's like, all right, I got no time for this. Like, I got to move on. And most of those guys were not that, but I'm in my conversations with them always went really well. But let's just say I saw other conversations with other reporters who were covering the team both locally and nationally that would just swoop in, and these guys would just be like, whatever, just kind of roll their eyes. So that's why I always feel like if you have a good group, and Miami has always had a really good group of local reporters, I think that always helps, because it kind of gives you a little bit of an edge, at least back then,
Yeah.
against the national guys, unless it's like, somebody that was like obviously the pinnacle of the industry. Like at that time, David Aldridge was like the man, and Michael Wilbon, obviously still the man, Stephen A. Those
Right.
guys would come in. It's different. But, if it's just like a national NBA writer for like a newspaper would come in, you at least had the ability, like you felt like you still had an edge. Whereas I feel like now it's much tougher for a local guy to break a story, because the national guys pretty much get everything.
Yeah, I mean, you're preaching to the choir here. I pretty much, I wrote for the San Jose Mercury News, covered the Warriors for a couple of years, and you try to break little bits of news here and there, but like the major transactions, the scoops on who's getting drafted, like Woj and stuff, like you can't do that anymore. It's not even a thing. But I kind of want to go back to those early teams, because it kind of feels like that first group that Dwyane Wade was a part of, the Brian Grant team, the Lamar Odom team, felt like almost like a college team compared to what it was when they kind of went pro with Gary Payton and Jason Williams in that group. I remember being on the bus going to school, and all that Shaq stuff was getting talked about, the rumors that he could leave Kobe in LA to go to Miami. And I remember writing in a notebook, like what the trade would look like. I think I was like in middle school or early high school when this was happening. And it would have been 8th grade for me. And just like frantically writing and like me thinking that I was the GM of the team, trying to decide whether or not I wanted to do this, because that was the team that I fell in love with, was that first Heat team, Dwyane Wade's rookie year. That's what got me into basketball, was that team. And then to kind of blow that team up seemed ridiculous, but then it was for Shaq. I mean, how could you not? It was Shaquille O'Neal. He was a star among stars. How would you describe what happened to the Miami sports scene when Shaq arrived with the Heat? Because everything I hear is that it was just a torrential change almost overnight.
No question about it. What I would say is, look, Pat Riley coming to Miami in 1995 on my birthday, by the way, my 18th birthday, was huge. It was seismic. There's no question about it. And those Zoe, Timmy, Mash teams, you know, at the early stages of my career, occasionally, that last year of that group, I swooped in a few times here and there in 2000, before they lost to the Knicks with the whole Clarence Weatherspoon game, Jamal Mashburn, et cetera, et cetera. But I didn't have a ton of interaction with them. But those teams mattered to Miami. And they mattered, I think, in the national scope because it was against the Knicks. And it was the Riley against the Knicks and all that. But then for a couple of years, the team, Zoe obviously had the illness that we talked about. And they kind of fell off the national radar for a few years. And that Wade team, the first team, kind of got them back a little bit on the national radar. They were they won the first round series. Obviously, everyone remembers the big game winner Dwyane had over Baron Davis when he crossed him up. And I think, I think it helped also that, Marv Albert was doing that game, because you're talking about like the signature voice in NBA history, right?
Oh, yeah.
Is
Yeah.
Dwyane Wade's first game winner in the playoffs. Like, I think that matters, like when you look at just kind of the way it goes down. So you're right. I think South Florida fell in love with that team. I remember doing talk radio at the time, and people were like, no, we can't trade Lamar and Karan. And I was like, are you out of your mind? Like, are you looking at who they're trying to get here? Like, this is crazy. So, yeah, Shaq gets here, and immediately everything changes. It was like, Shaq and Dwyane and I have talked about this for stories in the past when I've been at ESPN about, like, they were kind of the original Heatles. They didn't really get, because just the internet wasn't what it was, in 2010, 11, 12, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But they were the original Heatles. Like, I went on the road with that team a ton, and there were a lot of people waiting for them when the bus arrived and all that stuff. And, obviously because of Shaq and Kobe and their issues, those Christmas games were magnified times a bazillion. You know what I mean? Like, so anytime they played,
They put Christmas on the map. They put Christmas on the map, I think.
Yeah,
those Heat Lakers games.
Yeah, I think in the modern era, like I'm talking about like cable included, right? Because,
Right.
There's obviously so many different eras of television. Those games, I want to say, I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but I would say that game, that first Kobe Shaq game, is probably still one of the highest rated Christmas games that we've ever had in the modern era. So yeah, they did. And then Dwyane and Kobe would go at it, and you got to see that. So I do think that changed the landscape in a lot of ways. It helped elevate Dwyane. It helped elevate the franchise. And then eventually they won that championship. They got past the Pistons. They won that championship. And I think, it took the team to a different level for sure.
I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about your role with ESPN, because I'm very curious about it, because you do all these different things. You have your radio show in LA. You're doing play-by-play, sideline reporting. You're on TV, Around the Horn. You used to guest host The Jump when that was a show. Like, of all the gigs, what was maybe the hardest or took the most getting used to?
Oh, play-by-play is the hardest. I don't even think it's close. All the other ones, I mean, I'm not saying that the other ones are easy,
Right.
But I've been doing radio for 20 years. Like, I can do a radio show in my sleep right now if I wanted to. I probably do. I don't know. I'd have to ask my wife. And hosting studio shows, I think that takes a minute, or that takes probably a good amount of reps, whether it's The Jump or NBA Today now or whatever. I think those shows take a minute to just get used to the beats of it, right? Like, every show has different pacing to it. But once you've done a few, like a decent number of them, like, you can kind of get through any of those type of shows, even though the beats may be a little different. So that took a little bit of time, but I think with reps, you can get through that fairly easy.
Mhm.
and then be comfortable. I think getting comfortable is a different level than just being able to do it, right? So I
Right.
could, after a few shows, I could do it. I'd probably need like 10 or 20 shows to get comfortable, really comfortable, initially at least. Not now. I could probably swoop in and do a lot of studio shows and do them fairly well. And after a couple of episodes, I can feel comfortable. But play by play is hard because you can't, in a studio show, you in a radio show or even around the horn or any of those like talk shows,
Right.
you know what's
Prep.
coming. You
Yeah.
know what I'm saying? When you're doing a game, you don't know what's coming. So I think that is so hard. And especially having done it on radio is even harder because you have to be ultra descriptive. You have
Yeah.
to tell people, let's say if I'm doing a football game, right? Like I've done college football and NFL this past year. It's like you got to tell people down and distance, where the ball is, what hash mark it is, when the ball is snapped, how many steps the quarterback is taking. Do they hand off the ball? Do they play action? Are they looking to the right? Are they looking to the left? Are they looking down the middle of the field? Are they throwing it to the right? Are they throwing it to the right? It's caught at the numbers.
Right.
The receiver catches it at the 40. He's at the 45, 50, whatever. You know what I mean? Out of bounds at the 45-yard line of the opposing team. Like there's a lot of stuff you got to say. And, and then time, down, and distance again. And it's over and over and over again. With football, at least there's a rhythm to it. Basketball to me is the most fun because it's just constant chaos and movement. And also, I know the league better than I know. I mean, college football, I love college football, but it was hard to do college football play-by-play because there's 85 scholarship players. There's double numbers. There's 2 number ones, one on offense, one on defense. Like that stuff is hard.
Yeah.
Whereas with the NBA, because I covered the league for so long, I know all the players by memory. I don't have to look at my notes. In college, or in football, you need a spotter. Like there's literally someone there next to me. When someone makes a catch, he's pointing on my chart, and I look down very quickly if I don't recognize the player off the top of my head, and be like, "Yeah, that was a catch by Joe Johnson at Oklahoma. The wide receiver for Oklahoma.
Right.
Tackle made by," and he's pointing on the defensive side by, John Doe, the
Yeah.
defensive back, right? Like, so it's a team effort to do football. On basketball, it is a team effort because there's an analyst there and a producer, but you're more in control. So I think because of my background with the NBA and just understanding the game the way I do and knowing every single player by memory, it made it a little easier. But play by play on radio is really, really hard. I don't
Right.
think there's any question.
And doing all of that while trying to put your own flair in it, make it yours, make
Right.
make your personality stand out. That's why I don't know if you've gotten a chance to listen to Jax since going from sideline to the
Very
Heat radio.
little.
Yeah,
Very little. Yeah.
I've caught a couple of the games in the car, and I was like, oh, early in the season, it was a little. He was newer to it, and then by the end of the year, I was like, oh, this guy's got this figured out, and I know it's Jax. Like you can hear it.
Yeah, yeah. I would say the first couple games I heard him, yeah, you listen,
It's
you're getting
hard.
thrown to the wolves in that
Yeah.
situation. And on radio, again, you're naked out there, figuratively, right? Like there's no graphics to back you up. You're not on TV. The picture's not telling the story. You got to tell the story. That's
Yeah.
a hard skill to acquire. And I did, I thought Jack's, knowing him for so long, to your point, I think he did. I thought he did a really good job at the beginning, but by the end of the season, the couple times I heard him, he sounded incredible, I thought.
Yeah.
So yeah, it takes a while, but the reps matter because you're gonna start to see things evolve as you keep doing games. So I think that's just part of it. There's a learning curve for anyone, no matter how long you've been doing this. If you've never done something, it's a completely different muscle to do play by play. I actually think doing play by play on radio will make you better on television because you don't have to be as descriptive on television. You can be more of a storyteller on television. And also the analyst plays a much bigger role on TV in games I've done on TV as opposed to radio.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. A couple more questions here, but why did you get into sports radio? Like, who were you listening to growing up in Miami? Like, what kind of led you down that path?
Um, I just gravitated to it. I used to go to games with my dad and we used to listen to it on the drive home and I used to just kind of love it. And I would listen to it. I'm old enough at 44 to have like an old alarm clock radio in my room when I was a kid. And I used to just listen to late night radio, with Ed Kaplan, was the late night guy on QAM back then in those days. And I'd fall asleep to him because he'd be on until 2 in the morning or until the last game ended. That was kind of his
Right.
moniker. So that's where it started. And I'd listen to Hank Goldberg, obviously, who was around forever. Jim Mandich, Joe Rose, those guys. So I felt like, yeah, like very early on, I felt like this is what I want to do. And I probably would have loved to have gotten into like calling games earlier in my career, but I felt like I just wanted to get in the business. And I had big opinions. Sometimes my opinions were a little too big at times. Um, and I may have said a few things when I was younger about other people around town doing it that probably I wouldn't say now. As I've gotten older, I think you become more more risk averse, and you start to realize you're not some snot nosed punk anymore, right? Like you don't have to be
Right.
disrespectful towards people. There's still a way you can be interesting, entertaining, and fun without being completely disrespectful. But back then, sports talk radio in this is the early 2000s, right? It was only in its infancy still because it really was a 90s thing. So everybody was taking shots at everybody, and I was like, yeah, well, this is what you got to do. So you just got to take shots at people. But it really was what got me in the business, and it's why I still do it. I still love the freedom of it. I think that to me
Mhm.
is kind of the beauty of it, is that audio, regardless of what it is, podcast or radio or whatever, it gives you a freedom that the other platforms don't. So it's why I still do it 20 years later. And I'm guessing I'll probably do it for a while still. Like I don't know how look, a lot of it will just depend on my schedule. At some point I'm going to have to give something up, but I feel like I'm young enough now at 44 years old where I can still do a million things. Maybe when I'm 54 I'll think differently, or 64. But right now I still love doing it.
Yeah, and ESPN, there was that. Well, you worked for both stations down here at different times. Obviously, like you had the Lebertard group, doing 790 here, and then it just felt like ESPN just swooped all you guys up all of a sudden, and there was this just massive influx of Miami taking over like the ESPN national radio waves. Why do you think that was? Were they looking? Was it just coincidence? Were they looking for something that was specific Miami? Why do you think that happened?
So I can only tell my story. I mean, Dan had been
Yeah,
doing stuff for ESPN for well over a decade. Whether it was PTI or the sports reporters and
right.
writing for ESPN the magazine and stuff like that. So he'd been doing stuff for them for a long time. Um, for me, it started in 2009 when they first started recruiting me, and it just was never the right fit. So for a couple of years that was the case, but when LeBron got there, that really accelerated their interest in me, at least.
Mhm.
And I think Israel had also gotten there before. He had definitely gotten there before me. And he was writing for them too already after writing for the Herald for a long time. So, Dan was doing it first, and it was Izzy, and then I came in kind of third after that. And they were just kind of looking for someone to do takes, basically talk shows and takes. So the first thing I did before I even worked there was they put me on First Take with Skip and Stephen A, and I was going at it with them. And it was during that first LeBron season, and they loved what I did, going back at those guys. So that kind of led to more freelance opportunities with them. And then in 2013, so I had been doing stuff with them 2011, 2012, a little bit here and there. Whenever First Take was in town, I'd always do the show with them. And then I'd always do like hits on Sports Center and stuff like that. But 2013, they came at me with an opportunity to have a bigger role, right? Like my own radio show with Mark
Mhm.
Schlereth in the evening after Levitard, a role on First Take, a role on all their talk shows, basically. At the time, there was a lot of talk shows on ESPN. So I was like, yeah, this makes sense for me to leave now. So
So I think you have a unique perspective on this because what you were talking about before, in terms of that influx of Miami media, and they are just wanting like people who knew LeBron and that team and all these things. Now you have Heat fans complaining that they don't get enough national coverage and all these things. Like, do you do you think that that's almost a factor of, well, hey, you were getting all of the coverage you could ever want. You have ESPN dedicating websites to you. You've got every Fox Sports, everybody doing everything they can Miami Heat. And maybe there's just like a little bit of a whiplash to now where it kind of feels like finally that started to fizzle out. Do you think that it's true that they're not getting enough coverage, or do you think maybe that's a little bit of a factor too?
So I think that the coverage obviously during the LeBron era was overwhelming,
Yeah.
and I think that fans felt it was overwhelming because it was everything was the biggest thing ever, right? But you miss that is what ends up happening. You get used to that over the time that he was here or there, and you get used to it, and then it goes away and it vanishes, right? And
Right.
you have a well, they still had some of it because Dwyane was still around, right? But that was it. And then Dwyane left, and then it really became a problem because they were not a very good team, right? And they had no stars. So, and Dwyane coming back helped a little bit. There was obviously some national attention to that and finishing his career. I think there was some attention, but then that vanished again.
Hmm.
So I think that when you don't have what people would assume are quote unquote superstars on your roster, you're not going to get a piece of the pie, right? Because there's only so many minutes on a television show or a talk show or whatever, and they're going to basically go with where the metrics tell them to go. And that means talk about LeBron. That means talk about teams that have huge fan bases, in major cities. And, unless you're, or the defending champions, right? In Milwaukee's case, or you
Right.
have this amazing ascending superstar like a John Morant who got a ton of coverage
Hmm.
this year, right? Like the Memphis Grizzlies really got on the national map this year, but it was because Ja took the league by storm in a lot of ways because he's just he's such an incredible player at that size. So I think that Miami has a lot of lunch pail guys. Jimmy Butler's now getting that attention on the Michelob commercials or whatever, but I think that the bubble run was looked at in some ways, and I don't even think it was by the media who felt this way, but just by some, tangentially related NBA people, like it was a fluke, right? But
Right.
now this run has proven it wasn't a fluke. And I think Jimmy literally on one leg, scoring 47 points and then 30 something points in game 7. I think that will give them more of the respect that they crave moving forward, as long as they continue to swing big and find themselves in a situation where they're looking to create headlines because that's what this is all about.
Hmm.
It look, we're all beholden to clicks or views or whatever, and I'm not saying that you can't have more dedicated coverage to every team. What I'm saying is that coverage probably comes in more like niche stuff. Like you do a Heat podcast, right?
Right.
There's 3 or 4 Heat podcasts that are dedicated to the Heat. There's 3 or 4 podcasts that are dedicated to pretty much every team now. That's generally where you're going to find the best coverage of your team if they're not one of the glamour teams at the moment. I do think the Heat, though, because of their now 2 out of the last 3 years, I think that they're going to get that coverage moving forward as long as Jimmy Butler maintains being the star that he is. And perhaps they add someone else, they get headlines, et cetera, et cetera. I think there's always going to be a respect there because of that, because of Spoelstra being a top 15 coach, because of
Hmm.
Riley. But they need a star. And I think people wondered if Jimmy was a star. I didn't, but there were people that wondered it. So when the Heat really started getting going in the playoffs, it became a lot of people trying to play catch up on a team that they hadn't watched a ton of
Right.
during the season because even this year, if you look at the Heat's games on TNT or ESPN, it's probably like a handful, right? I mean, they were on NBA TV a bunch, but I mean, national TV still matters because everybody in the NBA is watching TNT and ESPN games. I'm not saying they're not watching their team if they're playing at that, at the same time, but generally speaking, they'll flip over to that game, whether it's the end of the game once their team is done or
Hmm.
before their team plays if they're on the West Coast, or they'll stick around for the West Coast game. So those games still matter in a big way to me. So I think that what will happen is Miami will get more nationally televised games next year. And I think that also helps them being in the national discussion.
I'm with you. I think, you do see this like with the teams that are left at the end, they do get a little bit more. And I think that those Jimmy Butler questions have been answered a little bit. I also think it's pretty clear that he's probably the best star on commercials, just from an acting perspective. Like those Michelob Ultra ones are good. Like those are actually pretty good commercials. I enjoy them. And then like, yeah, they got to the finals in the bubble, but those were like the lowest rated finals that the NBA had in a really long time. So it doesn't mean it's a fluke. It just means like that finals run, it matters in the context of basketball history, but it didn't really matter to most people because the ratings were so low, despite the Lakers and LeBron being in it. didn't really seem to register in that way. So
Yeah,
yeah,
well,
maybe after
it was
this.
also in October. I think that doesn't help. You know what I'm
That's true
saying?
too.
Like people are creatures of habits.
Yeah.
And what you've seen is the following year, the numbers were still low comparatively speaking, but far bigger than they were for the bubble. And then this year, I mean, the entire playoffs has been a huge bump. I mean, we're talking about some of these series. You know, you go back to when LeBron and Dwyane and Bosh were playing, right? Like to get to those some of the stuff in some series, right? In the first round or two, there was a lot of interest, so much interest that we hadn't seen in almost a decade. Um, and I think that basically, if you look at interest in the league, I feel like LeBron, and I don't think enough people look at it this way, but I know the numbers. I see the numbers. Okay. The league had a skyrocket as far as average viewers per game. I'm talking about regular season, postseason combined, etc. It was, nearly 2.5 million people watching their games on average when LeBron came to Miami. And
Mhm.
little by little, that was kind of around that number, between like 2 and 2.5 million, kind of up and down. And then with the Warriors, it kind of maintained, but it dropped some. It was like kind of like 1.75 into like 2 in that range. Um, and I think that because there was no villain right between those two.
Right.
Whereas with the Heat, they were definitely the villains. Like especially early on, we all knew that. And I still think that there was this curiosity that we've never seen before. Even when Durant went to the Warriors, that one felt more unfair, I think, than anything else. I think
Yeah.
the best thing that happened to the league was that the Heat lost that first game against the Mavericks, or that first series against the Mavericks, because that really made year two matter even more on a bunch of different levels. I'm sure you've talked about it numerous times in this podcast, especially leading up to this last series, when Jimmy had that game six. Obviously, the LeBron game six was for the
Mhm.
blueprint. So I just think that um, I don't know if we'll ever get back there. I mean, maybe we will. I don't like to be an absolutist, so I don't like to say
Right.
never, about anything. But I just think that the way television is now, everything is just so parsed, right? That
Yeah.
it's a lot more difficult to get to those numbers. But yeah, I mean, those early years of the Eagles was basically like the best numbers they'd had since the Jordan era. So, and again,
Yeah,
different times as we discussed because television was different back then.
right. And the league was different, and I think what fans expected from the league was different. Like when LeBron teamed up with D Wade and Chris Bosh, the reaction was like anger. And so even if you weren't a Heat fan, you were kind of tuning in to hate watch. Like it's like the Fox News thing. Like, yeah, you're getting a bunch of people watching Fox News because they're all about whatever Fox News is. But sometimes people are just like hate watching Tucker Carlson. They're like, what's this guy gonna say? It's kind of similar type of thing. Where like with the Warriors, we had been through the LeBron thing, so the anger kind of goes away because the player empowerment movement takes over and we're more accepting of it. But it wasn't anger; it was more like kind of bummed out that they were so good, and it kind of felt like the league was just like, "All right, you're going to win a bunch of championships, and we'll just wait this out." I guess So maybe I could see why like the ratings were such a way with those early Heat teams with LeBron than versus even when the Warriors were going with their dynasty. But um, I've got a theory I want to just run by you really quick on just sort of sports markets, and I think you're the perfect person to run this by because you're in LA now, great baseball town, great media, sports media town, and that's when you kind of think of great sports cities like New York, Chicago, San Francisco. I just all of them have huge baseball followings, and everything else sort of just layers on top of that, right? On that Sunday, um, I that to me is the thing that's holding Miami back from being considered a great sports town, like nationally, is basically because the Marlins are doing the best they can to keep fans away. Am I wrong? Like, what do you think about my theory there?
That's an interesting theory. I never really thought of it that way, but I like it. And yeah, the Dodgers get 5 million people through the turnstiles,
Yeah.
and they've got this insane deal on TV. It's, I believe, still the highest baseball television contract, and obviously the Lakers have an incredible, the highest. I think they still have the highest TV contract. The Knicks is weird only because MSG, they own MSG Network. Like
Right.
I don't know how that works itself out, but yeah, I think you're right. This is one of the towns where literally football is third every day. Like even
Crazy.
I mean, listen, I'll give you an example. The Rams won the Super Bowl, and I love the Rams. I have a great relationship with them, and particularly Sean McVay. But if LeBron would have, I don't know, broken some like Kareem's record that day, like on the same day of the Super Bowl, we'd be talking about LeBron breaking Kareem's record before the Super Bowl, I think, because of it being the Lakers, you know. And conversely, the Dodgers. Now, baseball, it's weird. I think people mostly want to talk baseball on sports talk radio when things are not going great, right? Like the Dodgers
Right.
got swept by the Pirates. So I can talk about that and what the hell's going on, what, what the bleep. Because, in baseball, there are measuring sticks too, like after Memorial Day, the All-Star break, right? And then the trade deadline a couple weeks
Mhm.
later. And then, the August, September 1st, right? As we kind of get down the stretch. So, when you get to those benchmarks, those 4 or 5 benchmarks in baseball, you can have big conversations around them. And I think with football, people here, at least, for 20 years, they didn't have a team. So USC was actually like their team for a long time because they had a great run in the early 2000s and late 2000s. But they kind of got the best of every world on Sundays, where you could literally
Right.
watch all the great games on regular television. You didn't even
Yeah.
need Sunday ticket around here for that. And I think the Rams have done a really good job of building a fan base, but it's going to take time. Like they're a distant third. And
Mm.
honestly, if USC with Lincoln Riley gets rolling again, they may be battling for third in that
Right.
situation. So it's a tough market to crack. It's definitely Lakers Dodgers 1 or 1A. But I do think that's an interesting theory, right? Because it makes it feel like the town is more legit and more diversified, right?
Right.
When it comes to their sports fandom. So that is an interesting take, and I hadn't thought of it.
Regionally, it's important, right? Because
Yeah,
it's such a regional sport, and baseball is so long of a season too,
yeah,
where it's just like if you've got people going to the ballpark, most of the months out of the year, it kind of feels like that matters more to a city. Like if you're and the sports bars start to pop up around the ballpark, and you're like, all right, you can't get a ticket to the game. Now you're going to a sports bar, and it kind of just everything kind of branches out from that. That's just my
yeah.
theory.
Agreed. That's a good point. I never thought of it that way. I'm going to steal that.
Take it. All right, let's wrap it up with a lightning round because you are bi-coastal, sort of. I know you're
Yeah,
in LA, but you lived in
yeah.
Miami
Still
for a
have a
while.
place in Miami though.
Oh, okay,
So
great. So you're perfect for this. All right, we're gonna go quickly through these. Atlantic Ocean beaches or Pacific?
ooh, so that one's tough. I mean, to go in the water, Atlantic, but scenic, definitely Pacific. Like I can go to the beach here and I can look to
Mhm.
my right and my left, and there's beautiful hills and landscapes. Like, Florida's so flat that it's
Yeah.
not as pretty. But to go in the actual water is no question in the Atlantic. Yeah.
Disney World or Disneyland?
Oh, Disney World. I like Disneyland, but Disney World, I mean, it's so much bigger. There's so many things to do. Disneyland is cool. You can actually do Disneyland in a day if you really
Right.
wanted to. You can't do Disney World in a day.
LA food or Miami food?
Hmm. I guess it just depends. I would say Miami is an underrated food town, comparatively speaking. I just think there's more kinds of cuisines here in
Mhm.
LA. But it's obviously, it's probably better for me that I don't get as much Cuban food here as I would in Miami, just for my waistline. But yeah, I would probably lean LA just because of the variety.
Pitbull or Tupac?
Oh, come on. I mean, I love Pitbull. I do. I've done stuff with him in the past. Like I've done events with him. But Kimmy, Tupac is like one of the all-time greats. Like, what are we doing here?
I had to do it. I was like, do I go with Rick Ross? I could go older than that. But Pitbull was too funny, so I had to go with Pitbull.
I like it.
Last one, greatest shooting guard in the all-time rankings, D Wade or Jerry West?
Oh, D Wade. I've done that before. People
Okay.
get mad when I do it, but I think Dwayne Wade. I mean, just look, Jerry West was incredible. He's the logo. I get it, but from an athleticism standpoint, like, come on, you can't even compare the two. I mean, Jerry's obviously a much better shooter than Dwayne, but his athleticism, his defense, much better than Jerry. If you extrapolate it all out.
George Sedano from ESPN. This was an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for taking the time, man. This was a lot of fun.
You got it, brother. Let's do it again soon. I'm sorry it took
Yes.
so long, but we definitely would do it again for sure.